So, hello and welcome to another episode of Flying High with Flutter. I'm your host, Alan Wyma, and today we have another manning guest. It's Renaldi. Renaldi, he is the author of Amazon. So, this is what is it? Amazon, Bedrock and Action. That doesn't really flow off the tongue, but definitely describes what the book is about. Welcome, Renaldi. How are you?
Hey, Alan, thanks for having me on the show. Great, thanks. I know that, yeah, pretty much Bedrock doesn't always pretty much, I think, is the smoothest thing to pretty much circle off the tongue. But yeah, pretty much, I think that book is encapsulating of more or less like what the theme is. And I'm pretty sure that a lot of our listeners out there will really enjoy it. And yeah, how are you doing yourself, Alan?
I could be better, but I think this short holiday of the sudden. So over here we have Christmas Day and Boxing Day off, and then we had Friday, and then weekend, and then now it's Monday. So I feel like it's been a long holiday with everything happening. And then now we have today. So tomorrow is another working day, and then off for another day. It gets annoying all these days off. I'm not sure how you feel. Maybe you enjoy all these days off.
No, no, we had a Christmas and Boxing Day off as well, and I think we're pretty much like following the same days off as well, pretty much with you. So we're gonna have a New Year's Day off as well. So yeah, for me, it's pretty much the same kind of off and on, and yeah, pretty much I think that's how it always is in the holiday season. So just getting pretty much like into it and just trying to make the most of it.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of making the most of it, I mean, there's a lot happening kind of all around the tech scene, and I've been trying to follow what's going on. So now that you're here, I can actually ask a lot of questions because what's going on with AI is quite complicated, and AWS is already complicated. So I feel like both of those not add together to make it more complicated, but they exponentially make it more complicated. Maybe we can kind of start to talk a little bit about, not even the content yet, but I believe you said you also have your own podcast, so you're probably a little more of an authority to talk about what are all these things, right? So I think we have some key terms to kind of break down, make sure that we're not that people understand what's going on, right? So we have AI, ML, Gen AI. Is there anything else that's kind of another key term that we should be aware of?
So I think that probably serverless will come into play as well. That'll probably be one thing. Aside from that, prompting is a key aspect of Gen AI. So I'm assuming that probably will come into play as well. And fine tuning, retrieval augmented generation. I feel like that pretty much is a bit of a deep dive to get off with, but I think those pretty much will be key things that I think that we'll eventually touch on as well in this podcast episode.
I mean, why don't we just start to touch on those, right? Because there's a lot to say, right? Because I just wanted to have people have a base. I feel like I'm one of the only developers out there who's not really actively using AI in their apps for more than one reason. One of them is because I am in Hong Kong, so there is some restrictions. But the other thing too is that I usually work with more niche languages, like even Flutter's somewhat niche. So sometimes when I'm trying to, like, I tried Copilot for a little bit, it was giving me some suggestions. Sometimes right seems like more than not like wrong in terms of like what it's trying to suggest me to do. Or maybe I just didn't see things that way. So then I kind of just didn't see the value in these kind of things right away. But I would like to kind of try to have people have a base, people who are like me who just don't quite understand it. I believe this thing's kind of like they kind of pile on each other, right? I believe there's ML, and with ML, so machine learning, then you can start to have an AI, and then with AI, then you can start to get to like large language models and Gen AI, and maybe I need for you to kind of give an introduction about these things in a slow way, right? Let's treat this like Legos and treat me like I'm 5 years old, if you don't mind.
Yeah, right. So I would say that AI, let's start off with the concept of AI itself. So, AI itself is the ability of machines to perform tasks that would require human intelligence normally, which includes things such as learning, problem solving, decision making. And this is essentially empowering developers, especially as what you mentioned as well with generative AI to be able to help them in performing their day to day tasks. And I feel like what is most relevant to our audience here is how quickly it's developing. Like, as you mentioned, we had machine learning as well. Machine learning pretty much is just one particular subset of it because the overall goal for artificial intelligence is to be able to mimic human intelligence as much as possible. And jumping the wagon a bit, that's also where eventually this term of AGI comes into play, essentially. So it's essentially the whole concept of AI being able to act and mimic as a human, and potentially to try to act as much as smart as a human and make decisions as much as a human. And that's essentially the main goal as well of where a lot of models, such as what generative AI is currently doing, is currently headed to. So, and generative AI itself, which is the crux of our topic for today, is just one aspect of AI, because we've already been seeing AI for a while now in many different applications, whether it be in making simple decisions, making rule based decisions. But now with generative AI, we've really seen an emergence of a very new trend, which is essentially, well, I don't know if new is the word to use, since we've been actually seeing it for like about 2 years now since OpenAI released GPT-3 to the public. But essentially, it's very novel in the sense that it's generating text, it's being able to provide reasoning for how it thinks, for instance, and pretty much is able to provide insights on natural language queries, which are basically usual queries that we ask day to day. So essentially, just asking, okay, can you code me up a simple application for a IoT sensor application, for instance, or for instance, say, can you code me a simple application to uh, show me the weather for today and read it off from internet? And just it's really transforming the way, because it's changing how developers are coding. As you mentioned, yours already mentioned Copilot. So it's changing the way that we are, for instance, with coding, interact with code. So no longer do we have to start off with, okay, let's start off with, say, like a normal hello world, or pretty much start out with trying to put up like a starting template. We can pretty much just start to ask AI, the generative AI model, to create us a template instead. And of course, as you mentioned as well with LLMs, that's where LLMs come with, because large language models are essentially the powerhouse of these generative AI models. They are the essentially models, AI models that are trained on mostly billions of parameters usually, and they may be trained on various data, but essentially at this point they're currently being used in the generative AI context to provide the relevant answers based on what you're currently querying. So essentially, that's just a bit of a whirlwind introduction, at least from the generative AI perspective. But we're still seeing so many more interesting use case, I feel, for this, and I feel like we'll definitely talk about this remainder of the podcast.
Okay, yeah, I mean, there's a lot there, and yeah, so I mean, one way, like you said, is that you could actually use AI. I mean, because Gen AI is all about generating stuff. That's what the gen means, right? Generative AI can generate pictures, things like that. I've been having a lot of fun with Apple Intelligence and trying to generate stuff, seeing the limits of what I can and cannot do. It's surprising how we can do some things. Yeah, so like you said, Copilot is probably definitely another version of like a Gen AI, right? Because it's generating code based on the inputs, right? Could I also say that too?
Yep. Yeah,
Okay.
definitely. It's based on the inputs. Yeah.
But then you start getting in these other things too, like, you said the word prompting, right? So prompting is a little bit kind of confusing because I think there's another one that's like multi-prompting or something like that. Isn't that where you get to LLMs? Or no, sorry, maybe not. Sorry, I get a little bit confused over here because for prompt you could just be asking a single question like how tall is this mountain? But then there's like multi-prompting, but I thought there's another word for it where you can say, okay, how tall is this mountain, by the way? Maybe how many people have actually climbed this same mountain, right? You can start asking more questions, more deep about this kind of thing. What is that exactly called again?
Yeah, I think pretty much. I suppose that it's worth to break it down first. So, multi prompting itself pretty much is a combination of using multiple prompts to generate a particular result. So, essentially, and there's different ways of doing this. So, for instance, you might essentially have different prompts that you chain together. Say, when you have an initial prompt and then you follow up with another prompt, and essentially, you pretty much you just use multiple prompts to basically get to your end result. So, I feel like there's a different amount of other things pretty much that come along with it. So pretty much one of the things that I feel would be of importance, I feel, to this one is, I think, which you might be referring to, I believe, which might be multi-shot prompting, in which multiple examples of, say, like a particular output is provided, and essentially you are showing essentially what is provided to a particular prompt. So you're giving an example basically to a particular prompt, and from that you are building on it and using it to provide uh, show you how it can complete complex tasks. So you're essentially pairing, okay, these are simple outputs, and prompts that come later on will are expected to also answer in this particular with these particular examples as format. I think that what you're referring to. Correct me if I'm wrong, but at least like with that example, I feel like that's pretty much like what you might be referring to with at least your example of multi-prompting.
Yeah, that could be what I'm thinking about. I'm just trying to like I did this kind of like one day prep course. Actually, sorry, it's 1 hour prep course with AWS training, and they gave a lot of kind of the breakdown of the things, and I was like very overwhelmed because I just know, as you can see, I just know the super basics of this, and then of course they had to put all their services in. Okay, fine, it's good to understand what they have, but then it became very very complicated to understand. But I was looking up more about Bedrock, and there's this. I guess people ask this question a lot. What's the difference between Amazon Bedrock or SageMaker AI? And actually, it looks like they have a nice chart on this page for Amazon that makes it quite easier to understand because basically they build on each other, right? My understanding is that SageMaker is more low level. You can bring in your own model, train it, everything like that. Bedrock is actually more so on top of that. It's a higher level abstraction where you can actually have existing models, including model from Meta AI, some others out there, and then you can actually just use that AI directly, right? Is that did I understand this correctly? Okay, shaking your head, yes. So it sounds like I started actually getting the picture. That's good.
Yeah, so at a high level, I think that's pretty you pretty much hit the nail on the head there. So SageMaker is certainly the service that you use, and it has been with AWS for traditional AI language models. We or AI models. We've already had it for quite some time already, and it was there much longer before Bedrock came into the scene. So, as you mentioned, it's very low level. It's used to pretty much create custom models. Usually, when people want to provision models by themselves, say for instance, okay, I don't want to provision a Meta Llama model, which is one of Meta's models on Bedrock. Say that I don't want an out of the box provisioning. I want to provision my own model on my own instances. And that's when you would use SageMaker. You would pretty much just pull it out and put it into a provisioning through SageMaker. And of course, it has its pros and its cons. It's obviously because it's custom, it's much more difficult to set up and potentially higher overhead costs as well. And because you're also managing it as well, of course. But on the other hand, though, if you're using Bedrock, you're having the main advantage of Bedrock is that you're getting out of the box models. So you already have models that's ready to use. Bedrock itself, to put it into as a definition, is essentially Amazon's offering, AWS's offering for generative AI. And how they do this is that they provide you access to different models from different foundational model providers in one platform. So you can just call these models through a single unified API. So without the need to have to connect, say, use one API for one particular foundational memory provider. So, for instance, say you decide to use AWS's offering of their own foundation models, you don't have to connect it at a different way compared to, for instance, if you want to connect to Meta's model. Meta's Llama, for instance, is one of the offerings that they have. If you're familiar with Anthropic Cloud, which is one of the other foundational models, they also provide it from there as well. So it's essentially a very easy to use way of being able to access these models right out of the box and just use them as is. And in general, it's just a much easier way and a much more, and of course, it's focused towards the generative AI context. With SageMaker, you can provision other algorithms, such as, for instance, like anomaly detection, which it's not as part of the generative AI landscape, but Bedrock is focused on the generative AI landscape. So it's usually language models, image models, multi-model models, and so essentially, it's just, as you mentioned, it's definitely a more of a high level, easy approach, and you can definitely just start calling it from your own application just with a few lines of code. So it's a very easy to use implementation, and that's why it's getting a lot of traction. So yeah, that's pretty much the main difference between that and SageMaker.
Now, I guess this is, a good question to have is, at what point do I know, like, if I want to go with something like Bedrock, where it kind of has everything kind of ready for me, versus maybe even like you said, I could take the existing stuff that Bedrock has, but train it myself or use my own data. At what point do I know which one to go, which route to go?
All right. And that's a really great point, Alan. And I feel like this is where we will eventually have to also introduce fine tuning as well. So this is really a case by case basis. So I suppose that it's really dependent as well on a few things. Firstly, it depends on your own purpose of the application. So there are a lot of applications that I know that can be achieved just from Bedrock. So for instance, someone wants to make a chatbot, pretty simple. You don't really have too much guardrails on that, and you pretty much just can get a chatbot running and just have it running on Bedrock pretty much. So you can pretty much just have it, like, for instance, like, have a conversation with it, have like a particular prompt to start off. So for instance, say like, okay, act like a particular, maybe like talking buddy. And this is, for instance, like when you don't have any context in general, or you pretty much want to say, okay, and give trivia questions or generate random questions based on a particular topic. Now, these kind of things, you don't really need context, so it's completely fine. Like, you can pretty much already assume that it already has general context, at least if it is not specific data that you're looking for. So you can pretty much just completely use it out of the box that way. Same as the same image generator as well. If you just want to say, okay, generate me an image on this style, and you just pretty much just set starting prompt to just keep generating images in that style, then it can continually just generate images in that style, and that's completely fine. However, then we get to the next step, which is you then need to ask yourself, okay, is there specific data that is not considered perhaps open to the public, that the model might not know? For instance, say like our own sales data, or data about if you're a car dealer, about cars that you're selling. So these kinds of data, you then have to consider fine tuning it. And when you fine tune data, you're essentially, and this is also a practice that's done as well within the Bedrock ecosystem, you can essentially train your model on your existing data. So you get your data in, you have your model train on it so that when it tries to answer questions, it'll refer to the data. So it's a bit of a process. So it starts out by looking at the prompt that you've submitted. It then looks at the relevant parts of the information that would be most relevant, and then it tries to answer based on that information. And then we then go into the SageMaker ecosystem. Usually, when you have very specific model requirements that are not in a Bedrock ecosystem, or if you have certain compliance requirements. Some people prefer to hang on to the instance or have specific compliance requirements that does require SageMaker. That is one big reason why they would use SageMaker. Or they might want to pretty much provision another AI model that would not be generative AI suitable. So that they would use SageMaker for that particular purpose. Or they might just want to try to have SageMaker deployment to complement the deployment that you already have on Bedrock. That's another use case for it. Oftentimes, though, from my experience, it's always been usually that people don't find the model that they're currently using to be available on Bedrock, because Bedrock has a number of models that is supported, but some models, of course, are not supported. So pretty much people often go to SageMaker to search for that and pretty much just run and deploy their own model. So I would say that that's pretty much where I would see that the line is being drawn.
Well, I love the fact that you brought up like, well, if you want to stop people from accessing certain data, does that mean that there's no control? Like once I use Bedrock, that I cannot say, okay, don't generate these kinds of media, like, bad stuff. Don't do this. I cannot add that on top. I have to actually take this and go work with SageMaker. I can never just enhance what I have. Or is there a way to just, you could say, because I heard that there's like ways that you can say, okay, ban these words, like, I don't know. I don't even want to name things that you could do because people are doing all kinds of crazy stuff. But there's no way that, like I said, you can just add this to add some protections for this kind of stuff.
I'm glad you asked this, Alan, because data privacy and security are two really great topics that I love talking. Aside from my book, I also talk about this a lot as well with practitioners and people I work with as well. But essentially, it's a very big priority of mine. So to answer your question, yes, there certainly are. And one of the easiest ways you could do this is pretty much with guardrails. So Bedrock has a feature called guardrails, which allows you to control what is said and allows the model to respond accordingly when the user tries to prompt the model in a way that could be considered either out of bounds or could be considered just trying to get it to say something that should not be said. For instance, say if you're if you're for instance like running like a real estate bot, which is basically chatbot, which is basically providing, say, information about properties currently on sale, and then suddenly someone starts to ask about, okay, well, would you recommend me to buy stock A stocks on the stock market? Now, that should be something probably that you could get in financial and legal trouble with because your bot is giving unsolicited advice on something that probably it's not supposed to. So with guardrails, you can pretty much set that, okay, I'm going to not allow this particular topic to be talked about. And you can essentially just keep it that way. And you can pretty much also just narrow the scope as well. Okay, these are pretty much what you should pretty much be talking about. And essentially, it just prevents people from just trying to use it for the wrong purposes. And aside from that, as well, of course, AWS themselves already have a good guarantee as well of they don't train on your own data as well, and pretty much it's a very robust guarantee. So I think it's mostly there are some purposes that I believe when it comes to security wise and data privacy wise that I believe are just some very strict company policies sometimes that would usually necessitate people to go to SageMaker. But for most use cases, I believe that uh, Bedrock is able to mitigate these kinds of concerns pretty well, especially since a lot of workflows usually goes through AWS ecosystem. And at least, for instance, for like encryption, for like data at rest, these kinds of things, pretty much across the AWS ecosystem, AWS supports pretty well. So normally, I don't see too much of a concern with it. I think it's really on a case by case basis as far as in my experiences.
Okay. Well, yeah, that's good to hear because that sounds really inflexible, and I'm sure a lot of people want to put in some guardrails. You made a lot of really good points, but I would like to kind of talk a little bit more about the practical uses of kind of Bedrock, right? So we heard already kind of what it is, and if we need something more customized, what we can do about that, and how we can still even customize more with Bedrock. But when do I know when I want to add an AI to my application? Because I mean, I can still do a lot without AI. So when would I want to start to add AI, and what would be kind of some initial steps that I would want to use with AI, just high level?
Sure. I think for the purposes of this episode, since we're talking about generative AI, when focusing on generative AI, I'm probably going to focus as well my answer based on that generative AI context as well. So assuming, when do we know when we should look at utilizing generative AI workflows? And I think it's really always just understanding your purpose well. So I think first of all, it's important to take a step back and understand the purpose, because I think that there's a lot of pretty much enthusiasm right now in the market. It's like, how do I use like generative AI pretty much to augment my business, augment my app? And I think that in a lot of cases, certainly it works out, uh, and pretty much helps to enhance the value that is being provided. So firstly, in the keyword itself, ask if you have something that could be more generative. So pretty much chatbots have been talking about a lot. Chatbots are like one big thing. It's, for instance, it's like, do I want something that can augment what I already have through being able to generate something? So for instance, chatbots, the traditional chatbots that we've had, for instance, you only have rule-based chatbots usually. It's like, okay, you know, do I want to pay off my loan, for instance? Okay, do I not want to pay off my loan? Like these kinds of things basically are being asked. And with generative AI, you're able to capture much more intents. So if your intent is pretty much to look at capturing much more intents, that's a great thing, because with generative AI, you can capture it much more. So for instance, if you only have people, like, for instance, say if you're currently at a contact center and someone basically just says, okay, like pick between three options. Do I want to, for instance, say, like if you're in a bank, do I want to inquire something with my credit card? Do I want to inquire something with my debit card? Do I want to inquire something about other inquiries? Now, instead of basically just saying other inquiries and getting directed to like a line operator directly, we can instead have Bedrock capture more of the queries and pretty much just try to have it respond accordingly, and try to probe more into what you want to get out of it. So, for instance, say, okay, well, we already know that we already have the information that from the prompting. How can we essentially enhance that and capture more information before we throw it to human operator? So this is kind of thing, for instance, that could be had. And another thing is, if we already have our own private data, like I was saying, and we want our app to be smarter, to be trained on the data, to essentially be used to generate new insights. Now, that we can use fine tuning, as I was mentioning before. We can build a feature in our application, for instance, to be able to utilize the data that we already have and answer questions based on that data. So, for instance, we already have a smart solution bot, for instance, that we want to have to say generate questions based off of a particular textbook. We could pretty much try to train our solution off of that textbook and just have the generative AI feature answer questions or create questions based on a textbook. So long gone are the days of pretty much like creating questions on your own. You can pretty much, for instance, like say create generate random questions based on what you already currently have from the textbook, for instance. So these are essentially, I believe, some avenues that you could pretty much like look at getting it from. So, oh, and one more important thing I think is also the image element, because multimodal models have been quite a big topic, I think, these days as well. So to define it as well, multimodal models are pretty much way of combining text and images. So it's a model that pretty much accepts text and images as input. So for instance, you can upload an image and you can also say, please provide me a description about this image, and it provided to you. Similarly, you can see that how this can be as well integrated into your application. So, for instance, say that you might have a bit of an art critique kind of application. You might look at, okay, like let me for instance, make a feature where you can upload like a piece of art and just have the AI critique the particular art. So these kind of use cases pretty much are really great use cases, I believe, are currently transforming the landscape. And I think, again, of the question goes back to what is the purpose of your application? How can you leverage generative AI to make your application smarter? And I just think that if you want to make your application smarter, provide you more insights, provide you more interesting ways of engaging with your, for instance, like customer, if you're a business, then certainly makes a lot of sense pretty much to include generative AI in the use contexts or beyond that I've just mentioned.
There's a lot to unpack there, right? Okay. Yeah, you gave definitely some interesting ideas there. But there's also like quite a few ways to interact with Bedrock. Is there not, or is there only an API? I could have sworn that you can also feed it data from like a bucket, I think, and then there's the traditional API. Isn't there like also like a third method that you can also send data to it, like asynchronously or something like that? So I'm just trying to remember from the training day now.
Yeah, so the most common way is pretty much to do it through pretty much the API as mentioned. But as far as I know, with in regards to S3, usually you would use S3 as part of the data source for being able to use fine tuning on. So pretty much S3 usually is the data storage that they would use for. You would put your data in S3 and pretty much specify S3 as basically the place where you would fine tune the data based on. So you get the data from S3, you train it from that, you make essentially, and you create the fine-tuned model based off of that. So yeah, and also aside from that as well, you can also pretty much just test out the model as well straight from the Bedrock playground too. If you basically just have like queries or you want to like test it out or you want to generate images, you can also just do it as well from the AWS console, and just it's a click ops, I would say. Just yeah, click and prompt to get those out. But yeah, the API itself though is the main method that you would use to be able to prompt the model itself.
Mhm. Okay. Yeah, that definitely makes sense. I believe you said that you've worked with Flutter, and of course you know about Bedrock, right? Have you actually used the two together before?
Yeah, so great that you asked that because it was not too long ago where I was actually at a conference as well, was talking as well about a bit of integration of generative AI as well within some mobile applications. And one of the things that I did talk about was that you could pretty much just integrate it in the sense of having a chatbot. And this was pretty much what I was talking about before as well. So pretty much you, for instance, you have a mobile application, you already have a great user experience. You're, for instance, say like at least the bit of case study I put back then was like an e-commerce concept. So pretty much say you already have a great e-commerce application, you already have a great front end, you already have a great layout and pretty much great ways for a customer basically to engage with the application, but you can further then enhance it through then training a particular model based on the data that you already currently have in the shop and enhance your chatbot with that particular generative AI model. So for instance, say user goes to their mobile phone, searches up, okay, what would you do you currently have this particular product? And traditional chatbots usually wouldn't really know that because they'd probably be like, okay, do I want to buy a new product? One for buy, two for something else. Like with this, pretty much, you can basically just, okay, like, what is your intent? I would like to search for this product, and they'll find it closest thing to you, and then you can basically just confirm, and basically then you just send through a purchase. So that's one of the examples that essentially I gave at that time. Another thing that I believe that you could pretty much also utilize alongside with Flutter as well would be in terms of creating personalized dynamic text or language translation. So When I say this, one of the biggest problems of a lot of applications, I would say, is in terms of the multilingual lingual necessity. So, say that you're catering towards audiences in different parts of the world. Say, for instance, say, all right, like you're based in the US, but then you need to cater towards an audience based in China, and you don't know Chinese that well. So that's where you would then get Bedrock to help you in terms of language translation. So, say for instance, your users can submit a prompt through, and then you can translate pretty much the prompt that the user has already provided basically into the language you have already had. So a bit like Google Translate when you think about it, but funnily enough, I do find in a lot of cases, if you already have clear context, at least a lot of model LLMs are able to handle translation better than Google Translate in my experimentation, at least. So, and you can pretty much just create a feature to be able to convert all these particular prompts so that, for instance, when they get to you or when they get to like another user, if you're like on a chatting application, for instance, or the chatting use case, then you could pretty much just have it converted from one user to another in a very easy way. So yeah, those are pretty much like two use cases I believe that I think are quite strong ones to pretty much like serve as a testament of how strong it is. And yeah, there's certainly much more, but yeah, those are pretty much like two I think that we can uh, put in here.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. Okay. I'm also thinking about even ingesting other kinds of data such as pictures, right? Because I don't have it over here next to me, or at least easy to get to. Is I got those Meta glasses, and I'm kind of playing around with them, saying, "Meta, what is this in front of me?" And I have two Chihuahuas, and it's kind of interesting how sometimes it works, sometimes not. One time it said, I said, "What kind of dogs are these?" And it said, "Those aren't dogs; those are cats." I'm like, "Oh, that's weird and interesting." But yeah, I mean, what you can do with these things is really really interesting. This is what I wanted to ask. The whole chatbot thing. I mean, it seems like it's kind of everybody's doing a chatbot. I mean, is it really something that we should even be looking at nowadays? Because it's kind of like I don't know. It seems like everybody has a chatbot, right? And nobody really enjoys that. The reason I brought about the cats and the Chihuahua thing was because like some of the other issues I have too is like I say like, hey, what's this? What's that? Oh, I can't do that. I can't do that. I can't do that. This kind of stuff is a little bit kind of discouraging, right? So is chatbot really one of the best ways I can actually employ and use Bedrock in my applications, or is it really just kind of more context dependent, like what kind of app I'm actually doing? Is kind of more the question I want to go for.
Yeah, I think it's a valid concern, and I feel that again, it goes back to being what your purpose of your application is. I feel that at this point, I think it really depends on if you already have an existing application and a business use case, A, and if you basically want to, or if you basically want to just have generative AI as the centerpiece of your application, B. So there are a lot of, I feel, applications these days of what I call generative AI wrappers, which are basically just chatbots designed for the sake of having generative AI in them, and that's the whole purpose. So if that's the use case, I would feel that the market is very saturated with those applications already at this point, because I have lost count of how many different chatbots that I've seen in the market that are basically just okay, like you're basically just having an API connected to an application, which basically allows you to chat with it, and basically just and the developer just basically says, okay, you role play as this particular character, for instance, or oh, okay, you role play as like say let's bring in a teacher context, like you role play as like an eighth grade chemistry teacher and answer any questions that you have, and you sell the application like that. There's like probably thousands of them out there in the market right now. So 100% it's oversaturated. However, if you are instead combining that with a value you already have, with, for instance, the fine tuning case that I mentioned before, like if you already have data, for instance, from real estate, like for instance, say like you're a real estate like agency and you want to train data from, say, like the housing market, then okay, 100% that can actually work well because you are providing data, which is basically something that other people can't provide, into the particular chatbot. Or if you basically just want to integrate, say, a business service that you already have that doesn't even need to be fine tuned. For instance, say, as I was mentioning before, there are definitely cases that you don't even need to fine tune. You can use it out of the box. Say, for instance, if you are like a tutoring agency and you just want to use these kinds of models to basically answer questions and just have it complement the learning experience for your application, then 100% that definitely can be a thing. So I think it really, again, is really dependent, but I think that it really is dependent on what you have to set it aside from others. Do you already have a business existing use case? Do you already have a target for your application that others don't? Do you have specific data? There's a saying I really like, data is king. And I think that really rings true for the generative AI concept. I mean, even with the, for instance, like the foundation models we have right now, right? Look at the most powerful models we have right now. Meta's Llama models, uh, Anthropic's Claude, OpenAI's O1 model, for instance. All these models are trained on billions of parameters of data, and without the data, it's basically nothing. And similarly, as well with applications that we create, we need to remember that data is a key significant benefit to us as well if we have that, since fine tuning on the data can help it to be tailored towards our use case and hence provide people more value as well, because data is also something that they can get from us that they can't get elsewhere as well. So yeah, I would say that those pretty much would be the key things I feel that would at least set apart in developing things such as like chatbots.
Okay. Well, I think we're starting to approach the end of our time. Is there something that you wanted to state that we didn't get a chance to ask about? So that way I'm not, cutting off any kind of inspirational things with maybe you've prepared or have come to mind.
Yeah, definitely. I feel that one thing that I certainly want to talk about, at least like state here a bit more, would be pretty much the overall interaction of Bedrock itself, I would say, within the AWS ecosystem. Because I feel like oftentimes we view generative AI as like a one-stop solution. However, there's a lot of things that I feel are necessary when you look at having generative AI into your workflows. So, for instance, say, okay, like say we already have a working API model. Basically, we already have a working API. We already link it to Bedrock. But one thing that often we don't, kind of strategies we never really think about much is, for instance, okay, how do we start to balance like the scalability of these particular models, and pretty much like how do we essentially queue the prompts pretty much so that okay, they can appear like one at a time, and pretty much just ensure that the amount of prompting doesn't overload our application. And of course, this is where different strategies come from, such as, for instance, like using lambda functions. You pretty much just facilitate Lambda functions to process the queries, then pretty much store it to the application, or pretty much you start to essentially, for instance, like based on what users are getting into the application, you then store the data basically on some databases before you then uh, update the model that we have fine tuned on. Pretty much, for instance, say if we need continuous updating of our models based on what users are giving us, because of course, like we, as users come and provide us more questions and we provide more results, we also want the models to get smarter as well, right? So this is pretty much like where we can use the rest of the AWS ecosystem to pretty much build on what we already have. So I feel like that's pretty much like a key point, at least from a Bedrock context, that I want to drive home, because oftentimes, with the current foundational models that people are using day to day, we're using it like one time query, two-time query, but there's actually a lot more strategies that we can also utilize to be able to ensure that it works well along with the other services, and that you can actually employ these services so that you can have these services work to supply the scalability and to best serve those target audiences that might be in edge locations or such. So yeah, this is pretty much just like something that I just want to like put additional note to as well, especially since we're talking about Bedrock as well.
Okay. Yeah, it's definitely good to know. I mean, seems like you have really a lot to say, and I feel way underprepared that I probably need years advance to kind of be able to keep up with kind of all the information that you've kind of presented here today. But I remember you said that you have your own podcast, right? And I'm sure if you wanted to plug it, people interested in more about what you have to say and more on this topic, if you wanted to plug that.
Sure, yeah, happy to. So my podcast itself is called Serverless Sorcery. Essentially, it's just a podcast that's not only for the AWS ecosystem, but for any foundation model in general. But I often just have guests there and pretty much just talk about generative AI within the serverless context or not. Like in general, it's just meant to be an open discussion podcast on generative AI. I do try to make it a bit geared towards serverless, but in general, I just try to entertain any other discussions people have as well. So yeah, just basically plugging that in.
And of course, you have your book. It's on Manning. It's Amazon Bedrock. Sorry, it's Amazon Bedrock, right? AWS. No, AWS
Amazon
Bedrock.
Bedrock in action. Yeah.
Amazon Bedrock and Action. Sorry, I get so confused about AWS and Amazon. I,
Or
uh,
it took me the longest time as well to get used to it. And once I thought I understood the nomenclature, then suddenly a service that is on the boundary of that breaks the rules of the nomenclature comes as well, and I'm like, okay, I guess
yeah,
I don't know after all.
it's just too much stuff on AWS to keep up on, and they keep adding more and more things, which is good and bad. Bad for people like me who just don't have so much time to read up on AWS. But yeah, I may start to check out your podcast to see if I can start to pick up some of your knowledge on here. But otherwise, it's great to have you on. Again, it's Amazon Bedrock in action from Manning. So if you guys are interested in the book, don't go to Amazon to pick it up. Definitely go directly to Manning and buy it off the website, because otherwise you have to give Jeff a cut. And Jeff has enough yachts, I think, so can put some more into these guys' pockets so they keep creating great content. Rinaldi, again, great to meet you. Hopefully, we'll have you back on again in the future.
Thanks, Alan.